Cold marble floors offered no comfort to a terrified mother watching her 10-month-old son crawl toward the most ruthless syndicate leader in Chicago. Everyone held their breath. One wrong move meant certain death. Instead, the ruthless crime lord did something that left his hardened bodyguards completely speechless. Poverty had a distinct suffocating rhythm for Nora Lindsay. It was the heavy ticking of the cheap wall clock in her cramped apartment, the endless shuffling of past-due medical bills from Anne and Robert H. Lurie Children's Hospital, and the frantic heartbeat pounding in her chest every time she looked at her 10-month-old son, Theodore. Theo had been born with a congenital heart defect. The surgeries had saved his life but left Nora drowning in over $42,000 of debt. When her landlord threatened eviction on a freezing Tuesday in November, Nora had no choice but to beg her staffing agency for the highest-paying gig they had. That was how she ended up on Astor Street, in the hyper-exclusive Gold Coast neighborhood of Chicago, gripping a feather duster inside the sprawling, fortress-like estate of Victor Rinaldi. Victor Rinaldi was not a man people spoke of loudly. He was a shadow, a whisper in the back rooms of City Hall, and the undisputed head of the largest organized crime syndicate in the Midwest. His legitimate businesses, a string of boutique hotels and import-export logistics firms, were merely a polished veneer hiding a brutal empire. Working as a contracted maid in his home meant strictly adhering to a set of absolute rules. Never make eye contact with the men in the corridors, never enter the West Wing without explicit permission, and above all, never bring the outside world into the estate. But Nora's babysitter, a teenager from down the hall, had bailed at the last minute. Desperation breeds unimaginable risks. With no other options, Nora had smuggled little Theo into the mansion, inside an oversized canvas laundry cart, hiding him beneath a mountain of freshly pressed Egyptian cotton towels. For the first 4 hours of her shift, the plan somehow worked. Nora kept Theo in a secluded, windowless linen room on the first floor. She padded the bottom of a deep mahogany laundry bin with soft blankets, creating a makeshift playpen. She gave him a bottle, handed him his favorite plush bear, and prayed to whatever god was listening that he would sleep. Meanwhile, the atmosphere inside the Rinaldi estate was growing thick with lethal tension. In the grand office, a cavernous room lined with first edition books, Persian rugs, and bulletproof floor-to-ceiling windows, Victor Rinaldi was hosting a volatile summit. Seated across from him was Arthur Kensington, a ruthless distributor from a rival Philadelphia faction. Flanking the doors were Victor's armed enforcers, led by his stoic, scarred right-hand man, Gregory Walsh. "The shipping routes through the Great Lakes belong to me, Arthur," Victor said, his voice a low, terrifying baritone. He leaned back in his leather chair, absently adjusting the cuffs of his bespoke Brioni suit. "You are bleeding my margins. I am not a man who tolerates a bleed." "Times are changing, Victor," Kensington sneered, though a bead of sweat betrayed his nerves. "You can't hold a monopoly forever. We want 20% of the docks, or the union goes on strike tomorrow. Your containers rot." The room plunged into a suffocating silence. Gregory Walsh subtly shifted his stance, his hand drifting toward the concealed Glock 19 under his jacket. Victor's eyes, chips of dark, unforgiving flint, locked onto Kensington. He was about to deliver an order that would likely end with Kensington at the bottom of Lake Michigan. But down the hall, disaster was quietly unfolding. Theo had woken up. Finding himself alone, the 10-month-old had managed to grab the rim of the laundry bin, pulling his surprisingly strong little body over the edge. He tumbled onto the plush hallway carpet with a soft thud, giggled, and began to crawl. Nora was 3 rooms away, frantically polishing the baccarat crystal chandeliers in the dining room, entirely unaware that her son was embarking on a fatal expedition. Theo crawled past antique vases and oil paintings, his tiny knees sinking into the imported silk rugs. He saw a set of massive heavy oak doors slightly ajar at the end of the corridor. A sliver of warm golden light spilled out from the grand office. Drawn by the light and the muffled sound of voices, the baby pushed his way through the heavy doors. Inside the office, the tension was at a breaking point. Victor leaned forward, his hands steepled on the polished mahogany desk. Let me explain what is going to happen to you, Arthur." A soft, wet, babbling sound echoed through the cavernous room. "Baba!" Every man in the room froze. Gregory Walsh spun around, drawing his weapon with lightning speed, aiming down the sights at the intrusion. The Philadelphia men jumped to their feet, reaching for their holsters. There, sitting on the priceless Persian rug in the centre of the room, was a chubby, rosy-cheeked baby, wearing a faded yellow onesie. Theo looked up at the circle of heavily armed, terrifying men, completely unfazed. He spotted Victor Rinaldi at the head of the room. To Theo, Victor's shiny gold Rolex Daytona catching the light was the most fascinating thing in the world. With a joyful squeal, the baby began crawling rapidly toward the most dangerous man in Chicago. Panic, raw, and blinding struck Nora the moment she returned to the linen room and found the basket empty. Her heart plummeted into her stomach, a cold dread washing over her. She dropped her polishing cloth and sprinted into the hallway, her non-slip shoes squeaking against the marble. She saw the grand office doors pushed open. She saw the armed guards, and then she saw her son, entirely oblivious to the firearms pointed in his direction, pulling himself up using the pristine fabric of Victor Rinaldi's tailored trousers. "Theo, no!" Nora screamed. She threw herself into the room, not caring about the guns, the cartel bosses, or the fact that she was effectively trespassing in a mob boss's inner sanctum. She slid onto her knees on the rug, frantically reaching for her baby. "Please, please don't hurt him," Nora sobbed, pulling Theo to her chest. The baby whined in protest, reaching back out toward Victor's shiny watch. Nora curled her body over her son, pressing her forehead against the floor, violently shaking. I'm so sorry, Mr. Rinaldi. My sitter cancelled. I couldn't lose this job. Please, I'll leave right now, just don't hurt him." The silence in the room was absolute. Arthur Kensington and his men looked utterly bewildered. Gregory Walsh kept his gun drawn, looking to Victor for the order to drag the woman and child out of the estate, or worse. Victor Rinaldi did not move. He sat perfectly still, staring down at the trembling maid and the baby who was now trying to wrestle free from her protective grip to get back to him. "Lower your weapons," Victor commanded softly. The absolute authority in his voice left no room for hesitation. Gregory immediately holstered his gun. The Philadelphia men awkwardly followed suit. Victor stood up. He was an imposing figure, standing over 6 feet tall, a man who had built an empire on ruthlessness and calculated violence. He walked slowly around his desk. Nora squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the blow, waiting for the order that would end her life. Instead, she felt a large, warm hand gently touch her shoulder. "Stand up," Victor said. Nora slowly rose to her feet, her legs shaking so violently she could barely support her own weight. She clutched Theo desperately. Tears streamed down her pale, exhausted face. Victor looked at her, really looked at her. He saw the dark circles under her eyes, the frayed cuffs of her cheap uniform, the profound, animalistic terror of a mother protecting her young. Then, his gaze shifted to the boy. Theo stared back at the Mafia boss with wide, startlingly bright emerald green eyes. The baby gave a toothless smile and reached a tiny, chubby hand toward Victor's face. For a fraction of a second, the icy exterior of the crime lord fractured. Something flashed behind Victor's dark eyes. A ghost, a memory, a sudden and violent realization. He stared at those emerald green eyes. He had seen those exact eyes before. "What is your name?" Victor asked, his voice losing its threatening edge, replaced by a strange, quiet intensity. Nora," she stammered. "Nora Lindsay, and this is Theodore." "Lindsay," Victor repeated. He tasted the name. He turned his head slightly toward Gregory. "The meeting is over. Arthur, you will accept my original terms, or you will not leave Chicago. Get out of my house." Kensington, clearly outmatched and thoroughly unnerved by the bizarre shift in the room's dynamic, didn't argue. He signaled his men, and they quickly exited the office, leaving Nora alone with Victor and his security team. Mr. Rinaldi, I swear to you, I will never, Nora began, but Victor held up a hand. Gregory, Victor said, his eyes never leaving the baby, go to the kitchen. Have the chef prepare a warm bottle of milk and bring the imported fruit puree, the one from Paris. Gregory Walsh, a man who had disposed of bodies and enforced brutal extortions, blinked. Boss? Did I stutter, Gregory? No, sir. Right away. As Gregory hurried out, Victor leaned against the edge of his mahogany desk. He reached out, holding his index finger toward Theo. Without hesitation, the baby grabbed the man's large, calloused finger, gripping it tightly and shaking it with a giggle. He has strong hands, Victor murmured. Where is the father, Nora? Nora swallowed hard, the painful memory surfacing. He passed away before Theo was born. It was a hit and run on Interstate 90. They never found the driver. Victor's jaw tightened imperceptibly. He looked at the baby's emerald eyes again, and a heavy, suffocating realization settled over him. What was his name? The father. David, Nora whispered. David Lindsay. He was an accountant. Victor closed his eyes for a brief moment. He knew the name. David Lindsay wasn't just an accountant. 10 months ago, Victor had ordered a hit on a forensic auditor who had gotten too close to uncovering the Rinaldi syndicate's offshore laundering accounts. The man was run off Interstate 90 by one of Victor's enforcers. They had scrubbed the scene. Victor had been told the man had no immediate family, no loose ends. His men had lied, or they had been careless. Victor Rinaldi, a man who had shed blood without a second thought, was now looking directly at the collateral damage of his own ruthless ambition. He was looking at the widow he created, and the fatherless son who had just fearlessly crawled into his life. You have hospital bills, Victor said suddenly, noting the stack of unopened envelopes he had seen spilling out of her open tote bag in the linen room earlier that day on his security monitors. Nora blushed deeply, ashamed. Theo had heart surgery. I'm paying them off. Slowly. Victor walked back behind his desk. He pulled out a heavy leather checkbook linked to a private, untraceable JP Morgan account. He uncapped his Mont Blanc fountain pen and wrote a series of numbers. He tore the check out and handed it to Nora. Nora looked down at the slip of paper. Her breath caught in her throat. $100,000. Mr. Rinaldi. I can't. What is this? She gasped, looking up at him in sheer disbelief. Your debts are cleared, Victor said flatly, though his voice carried an unusual thickness. You're no longer a contracted maid. As of today, you're the permanent head housekeeper of this estate. You will live in the guest house on the south lawn. It has 3 bedrooms and a private garden. Your son will have full access to my private medical staff, including Dr. Jonathan Hayes at Northwestern. Nora's knees buckled, but she caught herself against the leather chair. Why? Why are you doing this for us? Victor looked at the baby, who was still trying to reach for him from Nora's arms. The guilt, an emotion Victor Rinaldi hadn't felt in decades, clawed at his chest like a caged animal. He couldn't tell her the truth. Not yet. The truth would destroy her. Because Nora, Victor lied smoothly, his eyes darkening with a complex storm of regret and newfound resolve, this house has been cold for far too long, and a boy needs a safe place to grow up. As Gregory returned with the warmed bottle, Victor knew that bringing them into his inner circle was the most dangerous decision he had ever made. Because in the criminal underworld, weaknesses were exploited, and Victor had just adopted a glaring, beautiful weakness. But as he watched Theo happily drink the milk, the Mafia boss made a silent vow. He would burn the entire city to the ground before he let anyone harm this child again. And the real test of that vow was already approaching faster than he could have ever anticipated. For 6 months, the Astor Street estate felt less like a heavily guarded fortress, and more like an unconventional sanctuary. The oppressive, lingering chill that had defined Victor Rinaldi's home for decades had been entirely chased away by the bright, chaotic energy of a toddler. Nora Lindsay thrived in her new role. As head housekeeper, she managed the estate with a gentle but firm hand. Her paralyzing debt a thing of the past. Theo, now 16 months old, was a localized hurricane of joy. His congenital heart defect was closely monitored by Dr. Jonathan Hayes at Northwestern Memorial Hospital, and thanks to Victor's limitless resources, the boy was growing stronger every day. The most shocking transformation, however, was in Victor himself. The undisputed king of the Chicago underworld had developed a blind spot. He still ran his empire with ruthless efficiency, but his evenings were no longer spent orchestrating illicit logistics in smoke-filled back rooms. Instead, he could often be found in the sunroom, his bespoke suit jacket discarded, helping Theo build towering structures out of wooden blocks. Even Gregory Walsh, the stoic enforcer, had softened, carrying emergency pacifiers in the same jacket pocket as his spare ammunition magazines. But in the criminal underworld, peace is an illusion, and secrets buried in blood never stay buried for long. Arthur Kensington had not forgotten the humiliation he suffered in Victor's office. Banished back to Philadelphia with his pride in tatters, Kensington became obsessed with the sudden, inexplicable vulnerability of the Midwestern kingpin. He hired a disgraced black market private investigator to dig into the background of the Maid and her child. It took months of sifting through encrypted police databases and financial records, but eventually the investigator struck gold. Kensington discovered the police report from the hit and run on Interstate 90. He linked the dead accountant David Lindsay to the forensic audit that had briefly threatened Victor Rinaldi's offshore accounts. Sitting in his dim Philadelphia office, Kensington smiled a cold, reptilian smile. Victor hadn't just adopted a stray. He had taken in the widow and orphan of a man he had ordered murdered. It was the perfect leverage. Kensington didn't just want a piece of the shipping docks anymore. He wanted Victor's entire empire. And he knew exactly how to break the untouchable crime boss to get it. The ambush was orchestrated with terrifying precision on a crisp Tuesday afternoon. Nora and Theo were leaving a routine pediatric cardiology appointment at Northwestern Memorial Hospital. Gregory Walsh was escorting them, his sharp eyes scanning the subterranean parking garage. The harsh fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting long, distorted shadows against the concrete pillars. "He's doing wonderfully, Gregory," Nora said, her face beaming as she strapped a giggling Theo into his reinforced car seat in the back of the armoured Cadillac Escalade. Dr. Hayes said his murmur is practically gone. "That's good news, Nora," Gregory replied, though his attention was fixed on a dark, unmarked van idling near the exit ramp. His instincts, honed by years of surviving the streets, screamed that something was wrong. "Get in the car, now." Before Nora could process the sudden urgency in his voice, the side door of the van slammed open. 4 heavily armed men in tactical gear poured out, advancing rapidly toward the Cadillac. "Down!" Gregory roared. He shoved Nora roughly into the back seat beside Theo, slamming the heavy bulletproof door shut just as the first suppressed gunshots shattered the quiet of the garage. Gregory drew his weapon, diving behind the engine block of the Escalade. He returned fire with deadly accuracy, dropping the first attacker with 2 shots to the chest. Inside the vehicle, Nora screamed, throwing her body entirely over Theo's car seat. The baby began to wail, terrified by the deafening noise. Bullets sparked against the reinforced glass of the Cadillac, leaving spiderweb cracks but failing to penetrate. "Victor!" "Boss, we have a situation," Gregory barked into his encrypted earpiece, pinning down 2 of the attackers behind a concrete pillar. "Northwestern Garage, level B2. We are under heavy fire. It's Kensington's men." 3 miles away, sitting at the head of a syndicate roundtable, Victor Rinaldi felt his blood turn to ice. He stood up so violently his heavy oak chair crashed to the floor. The temperature in the room plummeted. The calculating businessman vanished, replaced instantly by the brutal enforcer who'd conquered the city with his bare hands. "Hold them off, Gregory! If a single scratch falls on that boy or his mother, I will burn Philadelphia to ashes," Victor snarled into his phone. He drew his weapon, a custom 1911, and looked at his lieutenants. "Mobilize everyone, now!" Back in the garage, Gregory was running out of ammunition, and Kensington's men were flanking him. Just as one of the attackers raised a customized assault rifle to take out the Cadillac's tires, and trap them permanently. The screeching of tires echoed through the concrete cavern. 3 black SUVs tore down the ramp, moving at breakneck speed. They didn't even brake. The lead vehicle slammed directly into Kensington's van, crushing it against a concrete wall in a shower of glass and sparks. Victor's enforcers swarmed the garage, laying down a wall of suppressive fire that instantly overwhelmed the remaining attackers. Victor stepped out of the second vehicle before it had even fully stopped. His face was a mask of terrifying, unadulterated rage. He didn't flinch as the final gunshots rang out, neutralizing the threat. He walked straight to the Escalade and pulled the back door open. Nora was weeping, clutching a crying Theo so tightly her knuckles were white. "Nora," Victor said, his voice unusually raw, reaching out to help her. "Are you hurt? Is he hurt?" Before Nora could answer, a wet, rattling cough echoed from the concrete floor nearby. The leader of the ambush team, bleeding heavily from a chest wound, was leaning against a pillar. He looked at Victor, then shifted his gaze to Nora. A bloody, malicious grin stretched across his face. "You think you're safe with him, lady?" the dying man wheezed, laughing a horrible wet laugh. "Kensington knows. We all know. Ask him. Ask the great Victor Rinaldi who ran David Lindsay off the interstate." The silence that followed was heavier than the gunfire. Nora froze. The air left her lungs in a sudden, violent rush. She looked at the dying man, then slowly, agonizingly, turned her eyes up to Victor. She waited for him to deny it. She waited for him to draw his gun and silence the liar. But Victor didn't speak. He stood frozen, his dark eyes locked onto hers. The guilt, the unbearable, soul-crushing truth that he had tried to bury beneath money and kindness, was fully exposed under the harsh fluorescent lights. "Victor," Nora whispered, her voice trembling, breaking. "Tell me he's lying, please, tell me he's lying." Victor lowered his head, the absolute power of his empire meaning nothing in the face of her shattered heart. "I cannot tell you that, Nora. The drive back to the Astor Street estate was a suffocating nightmare." Nora sat in the back of the SUV, clutching Theo, staring out the window with dead, unblinking eyes. She felt entirely numb. The man who had saved her son, the man who had given them a home and a future, was the very monster who had destroyed her family in the first place. When they arrived, Nora didn't say a word. She carried Theo straight to the guest house, locked the heavy oak door and collapsed onto the floor of the nursery, sobbing until she couldn't breathe. Victor remained in his grand office for 2 days. He refused to eat, refused to sleep, and refused to see any of his lieutenants. He sat in the dark, staring at the empty leather chair where Arthur Kensington had sat months ago, realizing that the violence he had cultivated his entire life had finally consumed the only pure thing he had ever cared about. On the 3rd morning, Victor did something unprecedented. He called an emergency meeting of the 5 regional bosses. In a terse 10-minute address, Victor Rinaldi, the untouchable king of Chicago, stepped down. He signed over the legitimate businesses to a board of directors, dissolved his direct control over the syndicate, and handed the enforcement reins to Gregory Walsh, ordering a complete cessation of hostilities. Then he walked out of the main house and knocked on the door of the guest house. Nora opened it. She looked exhausted, her eyes red and swollen. She physically recoiled when she saw him, pulling the door partially closed to shield Theo, who was playing on the rug behind her. "I am not here to ask for your forgiveness," Victor said quietly, his voice hoarse. He looked older, the commanding aura replaced by a heavy, profound weariness. "There is no forgiveness for what I took from you. I ordered the hit on the auditor. I didn't know he had a family until that day you brought Theo into my office. When I saw his eyes, I knew." Nora's grip on the doorframe tightened until her knuckles ached. "You bought us. You thought you could pay off your guilt." "I wanted to protect you," Victor corrected, his voice cracking slightly. "I wanted to give the boy the life I stole from him, but I was a fool to think my world wouldn't bleed into yours." Victor reached into his coat pocket and slowly pulled out a thick, sealed manila envelope. He held it out to her. "Inside this envelope are untraceable passports for you and Theodore under new names. There is also a ledger for an irrevocable trust at Northern Trust Bank. It contains $50 million. It is completely clean, legally bound to you, and untouchable by anyone in my former circle." Nora stared at the envelope, then up at him, bewildered. "Former? I am done, Nora. I have dismantled my hold on the syndicate. Kensington is being dealt with by Gregory. The threat is gone," Victor said, stepping back from the door, creating physical distance between them. "You have the means to vanish. You can go anywhere in the world, far away from me, and Theo will have the best medical care money can buy. You will never have to look at the man who killed your husband again." Victor gave her one last lingering look, his eyes resting on the baby playing on the floor. A sharp pain pierced his chest, a punishment he knew he deserved. He turned and began walking back toward the main house, expecting to hear the heavy oak door slam shut behind him forever. "Victor," he stopped. The gravel crunched beneath his shoes as he slowly turned around. Nora was standing on the porch. She hadn't taken the envelope. She looked at the man who had broken her life, and the man who had just thrown away an empire to ensure her safety. She saw the absolute devastating remorse in his eyes. "David was a good man," Nora said, her voice shaking but carrying a sudden fierce strength. "And you took him from me. I will never ever forgive you for that. Do you understand me?" "I understand," Victor whispered. "But," Nora continued, tears spilling over her cheeks, "the man standing in front of me right now, the man who just gave up his entire world to protect my son, is not the man who gave that order." She looked back into the house at Theo, who had successfully stacked 4 wooden blocks and was clapping his hands in delight. Her son was alive, his heart beating strong, because of the protection and resources of this estate. Running away with blood money wouldn't fix the past. It would only leave them isolated again. "Theo needs his doctors here," Nora said, wiping her face, her voice hardening with a mother's unyielding pragmatism. "He needs stability. And God help me, he loves you." Victor took a tentative step forward, his breath hitching. "Nora, what are you saying?" "I'm saying we aren't leaving," Nora said, stepping aside to leave the door open. "You owe this boy a father, Victor Rinaldi. You owe him a life, and you're going to spend every single day of the rest of your life paying off that debt. Not with money, but by being the man he thinks you are." Victor fell to his knees on the porch, the weight of 1,000 sins crashing down upon him, finally breaking the dam. For the first time since he was a child, the ruthless Mafia boss wept. He wept for the man he killed, for the pain he caused, and for the agonizing, unmerited grace of a mother's choice. Years later, the criminal legends of Chicago would whisper about the sudden disappearance of Victor Rinaldi. They would say he was killed by rivals or that he fled to Europe. But the truth was far stranger and far more beautiful. The most dangerous man in the city had been completely defeated. Not by a bullet, but by a 10-month-old baby in a yellow onesie, and a mother who chose redemption over revenge. Did this story of redemption and a mother's fierce love touch your heart? Sometimes the darkest paths can lead to the brightest futures when we choose forgiveness over vengeance. If you were moved by Victor's transformation and Nora's incredible strength, please hit the like button, share this incredible journey with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more thrilling, dramatic, and emotionally powerful real-life stories. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below.